December 17th, 2020. There are a multitude of things that an individual can do to distract themselves from the monotony of the weekly routine we often find ourselves in. There comes a time when the screaming children, the uninteresting work functions, and the angry, dissatisfied customers begin to grind away at your sanity. It is important to relieve the mind of our designated cycles, and we all have different ways to find our respite. For me, traversing the terrains of a foreign land was my escape. There are only a few things in life I enjoy more than strapping on a pair of hiking boots and setting off into the wilderness with nothing but my thoughts to keep me company. I'm a bit of a curmudgeon, to be perfectly honest. I don't really care much for people in a general sense. So, of course, I work as a desk clerk at a major financial institution in New York City, one of the absolute worst jobs you can have with a personality like mine. So, needless to say, these trips are very much a necessity for me. The isolation provides the perfect sanctuary for much-needed self-reflection and decompression. This brings us to the reason I'm typing this post for the wandering eyes of the internet from my rather uncomfortable hospital bed. A couple of weeks ago, I had reached my threshold. Whenever I find myself daydreaming about bludgeoning an unsatisfied client with a broom handle, that's my cue. I arranged to take off 2 weeks at the beginning of the month, which my boss wasn't too happy with, considering the short notice, but I'm one of the best employees he's got. I may not enjoy my job, but I am exceptionally proficient at it. So, naturally, I ended up getting my way. I've been to many locations during my travels. Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, the Virgin Islands, Uruguay, and even took a few excursions into the Rockies. However, I'm ashamed to admit that up until very recently, I'd never been to Europe. I've read countless online articles about the many introverted tourist attractions that the continent has to offer. After hours of skimming through article after article, I decided on the Kasselberg summit in the Vosges Mountains, located near the French and German border. The place was once the site of a fierce battle during World War II. A battalion of Allied soldiers from the 141st Infantry were trapped in these mountains, completely surrounded by the Nazis. They were eventually rescued by a combat team from the 442nd Regiment, which was mostly made up of Japanese-American soldiers. It sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie, a perfect story that addresses the racial divide between the Japanese and Americans at this time in history. A story of true heroism, American soldiers charging into the depths of hell to rescue their brothers in arms. I can almost see the stoic faces of uniformed officers saluting as those musical horns sound in the distance. However, the road to glory is oftentimes stained in blood. People don't like to talk or even think about the wails of agony after a grenade explosion sends limbs flying into the air, or a field medic holding in a private's intestines as he screams for his mommy, or seeing a body get torn apart by rapid MG-42 fire. In 1944, the Vosges Mountains might as well have been the ninth circle of hell. My lengthy plane ride to France and hotel stay were about as boring as you'd imagine, so I'll spare you the details. Before long, I had rented some hiking gear, parked my rental car at a resort parking lot, and was making my way up a snow-ridden embankment. My previous endeavors had mostly been under the punishing Caribbean sun, whereas this time around, it would be under an overcast sky in the dead heart of winter's embrace. The winter here can be extremely harsh from what I've heard, but Mother Nature was being merciful at the moment. Besides, I'm from Josei. It'll take more than a little snow to deter me. I hiked for hours through the snow-covered countryside. The peaceful surroundings made it seem like I had entered one of those scenic wallpapers you see on computer screens or postcards. I listened to the light breeze pass through the surrounding trees as flakes of snow blew off the branches into the winter air as the melody of unseen birds sang in the distance. After a while, I noticed a nearby tree line. Through the tree line, I could see that there was nothing but a gray-tinted sky. meaning that beyond the tree line was likely a slope that dropped off. I made my way through the trees, and sure enough, I discovered that my prediction was correct. The slope overlooked a magnificent valley. The landscape seemed to stretch on for miles, an endless continuum of white dunes and frost-covered trees. It was truly a breathtaking sight, one that puts anything I've seen in my previous travels to shame. As I took in the scene, a euphoric feeling washed over me. I realized that this is what I came here for. The sweet solitude of the mountains, far away from the stress of the never-ending numbers and the non-stop complaints. Far from the expectations, failed romances, and estranged family. Here, in this frozen tundra, I felt like I was truly free. Should I have broken both my legs from a nasty fall and be swallowed whole by the cold earth? Well, maybe that wouldn't have been so bad. At least I would have died a free man doing something I loved, a dignified end to an otherwise meaningless existence. I gave a quick look at the numbers on my digital watch. If I headed back now, I'd reach my rental just before nightfall. I gave one last glance at the picturesque valley and then turned to make my way back. I had a good day's hike. Tomorrow I'd find my respite elsewhere. As I made my descent towards the trail, a dreadful feeling began to stir within, and I felt a heaviness permeate the air as the wind began to pick up its pace. Making my way back through the cluster of trees to get to the trail should have been a simple task. As an experienced hiker, I know I can do a pretty decent job of retracing my steps. However, my surroundings were not in any way familiar to me. I was 100% sure that I'd headed back from the same way that I came from. The trees now lined the trail perfectly, whereas before I could have sworn they were as sporadic as nature intended. At first, I dismissed this oddity as a lapse in memory. However, my uncertainty turned into cold despair after about 30 minutes went by, and the trees did not change their formation. They were starting to look like prison bars walling me in. As a man of reason, I reassured myself that I was letting paranoia get the better of me. Yet, as I continued, the path seemed to be more narrow as the barrier of trees closed in. I began to question myself. My mind insisted I had taken a wrong turn at some point. I stopped and pulled out my trusty compass to confirm that I was at least heading in the right direction. The compass needle spun chaotically, occasionally stopping and spinning in the opposite direction. I had no clue what could have been causing my compass to go haywire. An underground power line, perhaps. Whatever the case, it only exacerbated the icy feeling of dread growing in the pit of my stomach, as did the darkening sky above. After much consideration, I decided to continue forward. I surmised that even if I had made a wrong turn at some point, this path had to lead somewhere. As that thought set in, I spotted a barely noticeable impression in the snow where something had fallen onto the path. My first thought was that a pine cone from one of the overhead trees had fallen to the earth. Then I considered how strange it was that I hadn't seen any debris at all up until now, scrutinizing how neatly and deliberately the trees lined this path. As I approached the fallen object, I soon realized that I was wrong. There, lying in the snow, was a rusted iron cross. I picked up the old relic to examine it. A tiny swastika was etched above the numbers 1939 within the boundaries of the cross. I realized that I was holding what I believed to be an old Nazi relic. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of marching jackboots stomping through the snow behind me. The sound was so vivid, it was like at any moment I would feel the barrel of a rifle pressing against the back of my head while being screamed at in German. However, when I turned around, there wasn't a soul in sight. I pocketed the relic and continued down the foreboding trail. If nothing else, I thought, I wouldn't have to waste my money at some mundane gift shop for a souvenir. If it wasn't for the rapidly dropping temperature and dwindling daylight, I might have been almost excited that I'd lost my way. During my travels, I will admit that I've been turned around before, but I'd always rose to the challenge and found a way back to my destination through sheer instinct. But this time, the stress of self-doubt began to rear its ugly head as the bitter breeze had now turned into a harsh wind. Part of me viewed my current predicament as a manifestation of my own inner turmoil. Another part of me was focused on survival and determined to persevere, quickly dispelling my previous illusion of being consumed by the winter tide. Suddenly, a gust of wind bowled over me, slamming me face first into the deep white powder. I quickly tried to gather my wits and stand up. That's when I heard a haunting voice cutting through the howl of the wind.
Beweis deiner Wert!
It was far too audible to be just another delusion. I rolled onto my back to see if I could spot the origin of the voice. My eyes were met with a battalion of featureless silhouettes, hidden by a layer of thick wind. Seeing these still figures froze my insides, as my mind was consumed by pure panic and terror. The lingering twilight was now replaced by suffocating darkness. It was impossible to see anything. That was until the countless pairs of glowing yellow eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by a cacophony of furious, disembodied screeches. As I frantically scrambled away from the fast-approaching eyes, I heard a chilling voice whisper into my ear.
Jetzt hältst du unser heiliges Relikt. Jetzt musst du dich der Herausforderung der Ton stellen und deinen Wert beweisen.
Pressing my hands against the impending snow, I managed to lift myself back to a standing position. Towering forward into the never-ending blackness, the terrible shrieking and wailing from behind me grew louder. It was as if I had met my doom, and was now standing before the gates of hell, hearing the tortured screams of the damned, crying out in agony. This was madness. I desperately trudged forward, but the snow underfoot was making it difficult to move quickly. I could feel death breathing down my neck. One of my boots caught on something metallic and solid. Gravity showed no mercy, throwing my body forward once again into the thick snowdrift. I was terrified of what I might have seen if I had taken another look behind me. The violent wind capitalized on my vulnerable state, pinning me in the thick, cold snow. I tried desperately to rise to my feet, but my efforts were futile. I suddenly felt a heavy pressure, and my face was driven into the snow. It was like someone's boot was forcing my head down. Unable to stand, I felt around with gloved hands until I grabbed what felt like a tree root and pulled on it. My body was then forcefully dragged forward through the snow. I was able to move my head freely again, but my vision was completely obscured by the thick, lashing wind. The guttural howling and moaning cut through the relentless wind. I knew that I had to keep moving, or else I would meet a worse fate than freezing to death. I began crawling on all fours like a soldier on his first day of boot camp, plowing through the snow, driven only by my will to survive. It was then that I heard a thudding sound ringing out among the haunted torrent of screams and the fierce wind. At first, I thought it was an avalanche, and at any moment I'd be swallowed by a cascading landslide. But as I listened, I realized with a terrifying clarity that the sound I heard was marching. I didn't dare look back. I hastened my crawl to the point that my muscles felt as if they were on fire. The only thing that kept me going was pure adrenaline. Just when I thought that my body would completely give out and I would meet my gruesome end at the hands of whatever was making those nightmarish wails, my head slammed into something hard and metallic. I reached up to grab at whatever prevented me from moving forward, my hands wrapping around its metal frame with relative ease. I forced myself to my knees, using the foreign object as an anchor. I raised my head to see the rusted bars of a massive wrought iron gate. Pulling myself up to my feet, still barely able to see anything as the wind continued to violently thrash around me, I slowly made my way to the edge of the ancient gate, using its iron bars to stay upright. I eventually reached the edge of the gate and saw that it was mounted to a giant stone wall. This wall appeared to be just as aged and withered as the iron gate. Through the blinding gust, I could see the several splits and cracks webbing across its surface. On the verge of collapsing from exhaustion, I continued down the perimeter of the wall until I found an opening just big enough for me to squeeze through. The wind had completely drowned out the hellish wailing and shrieking behind me at this point. I charged through the opening and leapt onto the snow-covered ground. All at once, the relentless wind and the torrent of screams suddenly ceased. But I was far too fatigued to feel any kind of relief. I remained face down in the snow for an undetermined amount of time. Every single muscle in my arms and legs felt like they wanted to evacuate my body in protest. I remember thinking to myself, "My face. I need to cover my face." I summoned my very last ounce of strength to lift up my head so I could pull up my scarf to have something between my bare skin and the cold ground. As soon as the scarf covered my eyes, I instantly fell limp. My body had shut down completely. I then closed my eyes and fell into a deep sleep. If you were to find yourself knocking on death's door, you might pause for a moment to reflect upon your life. Perhaps your untimely demise just might remind you of all the mistakes you've ever made. Surely there would be some lingering regrets before you opened that door. Or perhaps you'll remember the warmth of a summer's day from long ago, where life was simpler and your innocence was still intact. I found myself pondering such things when a howling came from the distance to remind me of my current predicament. I felt a soft wind on my back as I regained consciousness. I must have been out for quite some time. Despite the pain, I was able to move with relative ease as I removed the scarf from my face and sat up. The first thing I noticed was the veil of darkness that surrounded me. At first, the darkness was unyielding, but as I sat there and allowed my eyes to adjust, the shrouds slowly began to relent. During my travels, I have learned to be observant, especially when I get turned around in a strange place. I could not see, but I could feel that the snow beneath me was only a few inches deep, unlike what I had experienced just on the other side of the ancient stone wall behind me. Surely, if I had been caught in a snowstorm, whatever this place was would have also been engulfed in heavy snowfall and fierce winds. There was also the matter of the haunting, hellish bellows that I heard. Why did everything suddenly cease the moment I heaved myself through the wall and crash-landed into this mysterious sanctuary? Eventually, my eyes could decipher the overhanging branches of a dead tree just a few feet in front of me. I focused on the looming limbs, watching them sway ever so slightly in the breeze as more of my surroundings were revealed to me. At this point, I was more dazed and confused than I was frightened. However, the next thing I saw would change that. Within the obscured twilight, I saw a figure that I instantly recognized. However, when my eyes fell upon it, I immediately closed them and allowed my own hopeless denial to consume me. No, please, anything but that. I whispered to myself, but I knew that behind my closed eyes, the hideous reality remained. I knew that no matter how long I sat there with my eyes closed, it wouldn't change a damn thing. I reluctantly opened my eyes to face the terrifying visage. Dread overcame me, as I knew it would, when I gazed upon a decayed stone cross protruding from the snow. I was reminded again of the mysterious silhouettes I had seen and the haunting wails that accompanied them. I was also reminded of death's door. Have I turned the handle? Is this what lied beyond? My denial melted away as I stood to my feet and viewed the countless rows of other headstones. A part of me became convinced that I had met my demise out there in the snow, and what I'm experiencing now must be some kind of separation from my physical body. My frozen corpse is probably somewhere on the other side of that wall. It was then, with much regret, that I had to finally admit to myself what this place was. A graveyard. Okay, maybe I was being a bit dramatic, thinking that I was dead, but how could you blame me after what I had just been through? I eventually overcame my initial fears when I came to the realization that, dead or not, I was still freezing my ass off. So, I decided to try and find some place to take refuge. As I walked down the rows of graves, many questions began to race through my mind. If this place was real, why was it located out in the middle of nowhere, high up in the Vosges Mountains? Another thing I found to be odd was that the tombstones appeared to be free of any snowfall. They were just dull, black tablets that disrupted the snow-blanketed ground. After awkwardly removing one of my gloves, I pulled out the complimentary lighter that I received when I purchased my hiking gear. The wind did not make it easy, but after a few tries, the spark wheel finally ignited, and I carefully made my way to the nearest headstone. Heiner Allmann, 1917 to 1944. Huh, sounds like a German name. I then moved to the next grave. Christoph Zobel, 1912 to 1942. The next, Diedrich Weissner, 1921 to 1939. Every stone I checked was the same thing. A German who died between 1939 to 1945. I wasn't even sure how far the cemetery went on for, but there had to be hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. I came to a frightening realization that this wasn't just any ordinary graveyard in the middle of the mountains. This was the resting place for the fallen soldiers of the Third Reich. The tiny flame of the lighter blew out as the wind once again began to stir, as if reacting to my discovery of what that place actually was. I regloved my hand and pulled my jacket tight as I staggered forward. I wasn't sure where I was going, but something from within told me to keep moving. After taking a few more steps, I happened to catch a glimpse of something to my right. I stopped in my tracks and blinked several times to make sure that what I was seeing was actually there. Leaning against one of the headstones was a rifle. I made my way over to it and picked it up. I turned over the gun in my gloved hands and examined it. I'm no gun expert, but I've read enough World War II biographies to know that what I was holding was a bolt-action carabiner 98K. I was disappointed when I threw back the bolt to see that the weapon was empty. This rifle would have made a fine addition to a vintage gun collection, but without bullets, it was useless to me. That was until I noticed the 5 bullets resting side by side on top of the next headstone. I couldn't help but crack a smile. I again removed one of my gloves and with trembling hands loaded each of the bullets into the old rifle. I only had 5 bullets, but I took comfort knowing that now I at least had some kind of protection. Shortly after loading the old rifle, I continued forward, holding the weapon out in front of me as I struggled against the hissing gust. The wind once again overwhelmed me as I was brought to my knees. I drove the butt of the rifle into the ground in front of me to stop myself from toppling over. I buried my head into my chest to prevent my face from going numb. The wind ceased, and I lifted my head and looked around. The first thing I saw was the headstone directly in front of me. What was odd about this stone was that upon its surface, where the name should have been, was practically blank. I could tell that there used to be a name there, but for whatever reason, it appeared to be removed somehow. The same was true for all the other nearby headstones. All the names were suddenly gone. A deafening silence had fallen upon the old cemetery. Something in my gut told me that the silence was an indication that a new threat was about to emerge. A strange, guttural noise cut through the silence. I frantically scanned my surroundings whilst aiming the rifle every which way, trying to locate the source of the noise. I then felt a strange rumble beneath me, and I gripped the rifle in my hand in anticipation of what was to come next. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the snow-ridden ground in front of me and wrapped around my ankle. I yelped like a frightened child as I fell backward. As soon as I hit the ground, I tried pulling away, but the hand only gripped me tighter as I struggled. I dropped the rifle and began kicking the hand with my free leg. After that failed, I used my arms to drag myself backward. As I did, I seemed to pull whatever was grabbing me up from the ground. I could now see a snow-covered arm emerge, and it was then that I halted my movements as a paralyzing fear consumed me. From the moment I saw the first headstone, an irrational thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if the dead rose up from their graves? I think that idea pops into everyone's head when they enter a graveyard, but of course, it's dismissed as malarkey. But what I was seeing with my very eyes at that moment defied all reason. Another hand emerged from the ground and planted itself into the snow as the ground behind the two hands began to rise. The snow fell to the wayside as the figure pulled itself up. The unmistakable shape of a helmet, followed by a pair of glowing yellow eyes, arose from the depths. The figure was now halfway out of the ground, still gripping my leg. A horrifying, skeletal face stared back at me. Its fleshless jaw opened as it let out a hellish wail. Despite the all-consuming fear, there was something inside me that was determined to survive, because the next thing I remember was me grabbing the rifle beside me and shoving it into the gaping maw and pulling the trigger. The face instantly obliterated, sending the helmet crashing into the headstone. Its headless body slumped, and the hand released me. I rose to my feet, and as I looked around, I knew that I wouldn't have time to entertain the endless questions plaguing my mind. I just blew the head off of a literal fucking zombie, and was now staring down an entire horde of his friends. The questions would have to wait. All I knew at this moment was that I was surrounded, with only 4 bullets left. I threw back the rifle's bolt and loaded another bullet into the chamber. The disembodied voice once again called out,
Fetch me his soul!
A dissonance of snarling, barking, and moaning erupted from the herd of these damned creatures. A cold despair sent ice rushing through my veins as I stared into the sea of glowing, malice-filled eyes. The undead horde began their advance as they dragged their jackboots across the snow. The ones who had no legs pulled themselves along the ground using their skeletal arms, leaving jagged patterns trailing behind them. Mangled jaws hung agape, revealing rows of decaying black teeth that gnashed at the air, unable to control their last remaining impulse as they lurched forward. Death's door had opened. Despite my overwhelming fear, my will to survive kept my hand steady as I squeezed the trigger of the rifle. Sending a round through the rotten brain matter of the nearest shambling corpse, its wailing cries of hunger were silenced as it collapsed into the snow. Gritting my teeth, I looked into the mass of the remaining shambling forms when a voice that sounded like it was being forced through long-expired vocal cords came from somewhere within the undead platoon.
Komm und sterb, es ist ein Schicksal.
I don't speak German, but somehow I understood exactly what the broken voice said. The resurrected Wehrmacht closed in. My next move had to be both swift and precise. With only 3 bullets remaining, there was little room for error. I threw back the carabiner's bolt, ejecting the spent casing, and slammed it forward once again, loading my 3rd cartridge into its chamber. I then took aim at another undead soldier wearing a black SS uniform with a red armband which donned the dreaded swastika. Its appearance seemed sadistically appropriate in that moment. I locked eyes with the undead Nazi, placed the iron sights of the rifle directly between its glowing eyes.
Give way for the Highness.
The thing hissed, its words seething with fascistic hatred. Another loud shot echoed across the ancient cemetery as half of the creature's decayed face evaporated into a cloud of dust, sending its uniformed husk backwards into the oncoming horde. The collision caused 2 other soldiers to topple like a rack of bowling pins, which created a small opening. I wasted no time seizing the opportunity to make my escape. I leapt over the fallen bodies and charged forward. As I forged ahead, another figure appeared before me. Its glowing eyes beamed like an oncoming semi-truck. I had no time to chamber another round, so I let the carabiner slide off of my shoulder while I swung the butt of the rifle into the figure's chomping skull. I heard it collapse behind me as I continued my frantic sprint forward. I could only afford to observe what was directly in front of me. If I allowed my curiosity to have even the faintest of glances, it might have cost me my life. I ran down the snow-riddled path between the nameless tombs and the passing rows of decrepit headstones as a symphony of starving, desperate wails pursued me. I caught glimpses of more soldiers emerging from the rows ahead of me, clawing out of their graves for the taste of warm flesh. The muscles in my legs felt as if they would collapse at any moment, sending bouts of pain down my stiff body with each burning step I took, my eyes watering from the non-stop bombardments of the frigid air. I knew I wouldn't last much longer. My body would soon succumb to exhaustion. However, a beacon of hope appeared on the cryptic horizon. The tall, shadowy form of a dead tree towered in the distance. It stood in stark contrast to the protruding monuments. The sight of its leafless, looming branches was a welcoming one. If I could just make it to that tree, I should be able to see the opening in the stone wall. Of course, there was no way of knowing if this was the same tree I saw when I first woke up here, but it seems to be my best chance at escaping this godforsaken place. The foreboding voice once again descended from the gray sky like a vengeful god.
Stop him before he escapes, you useless swine!
The anger I heard in the wretched voice told me that I must be near my salvation. However, the relief I felt was quickly overtaken by dread when the chorus of the unearthly wails behind me amplified to a deafening crescendo, as if the horde was reacting to the commands of the disembodied voice. I dashed past the lifeless tree and saw the breach in the stone wall from which I'd entered. Freedom was within my grasp. I charged towards the opening with unrelenting resolve. I came within a few yards of the opening when a pair of hands shot up from the ground and planted themselves in the snow. Soon, another unwelcomed resident was about to rise from the earth, and there was no time to evade them. I gripped the carabiner's wooden stock and shouldered it once more. The iron sights bobbed up and down as my feet plowed forward. Time slowed to a crawl. The wails of the undead faded into the background as my mind became singularly focused. I exhaled and squeezed the trigger. There was a flash from the carabiner's barrel as the bullet soared through the air and met the reanimated corpse between the eyes at the exact moment its head emerged from the ground. The repulsive glow of the creature's eyes died out as my right boot forced its rotten cranium back down into the snow, and I springboarded myself through the wall's opening. As soon as I crashed into the snowdrift just beyond the wall, I felt icy fingers wrap around my left ankle. I looked back to see an undead soldier protruding halfway through the wall. The only thing stopping it from advancing any further were the arms of his eager comrades trying to force their way through as well, clogging the small opening with a mass of squirming limbs. The hands of the horde thrashed and clawed as furious, muffled screams resounded from the other side. The undead soldier used its single arm to pull me towards the opening with unnatural strength. Black fluid fell from its putrid jaw as it spoke.
Ich werde dich zum Schrotter bringen. Sie wird nicht belohnen.
Using every last ounce of my strength, I twisted my body, snapping the soldier's arm from its torso. I then quickly sat upright and jammed the barrel of the carabiner into its dripping orifice. I chambered my final round and stared directly into the Wehrmacht's luminous eyes. "Choke on this, you fucking Nazi!" Black fluid sprayed the stone wall as the final round exited through the back of the soldier's skull. The rifle turned to ash in my gloved hands, and the ground beneath me collapsed, sending me plummeting into unknown depths. The last thing I remember hearing was the disembodied voice calling over the howl of the wind.
No!
My eyes opened to see two strangers dressed in hiking gear. The look in their eyes was a mixture of shock and fear. The vision immediately faded into blackness. When my eyesight returned to me, I found myself in a room bathed in a dull fluorescent light. A woman wearing a white lab coat was examining a clipboard at the foot of the bed I was resting on. I tried sitting up, but was quickly devastated by a crippling pain throughout my entire body. She looked up from her clipboard as soon as she heard my groans of discomfort.
"Sir, please don't move."
I heard a soft, accented voice say, before I vomited all over my hospital gown and passed out. An undetermined amount of time passed. The comforting darkness was interrupted by the chattering of two female voices. They were speaking in German, talking about how careless and ignorant Americans are, and how they should stay in their own country. My eyes snapped open, and I glared at the two gossiping women standing in the doorway wearing nurse uniforms. When they noticed that I was awake, they gave me an uncomfortable look before hurrying off down the hallway. It wasn't until I was left alone, listening to the constant rhythmic beeping of the monitor next to my bed, that I realized I was able to understand the women perfectly. As the days passed, I slowly began to regain my mobility. The female doctor eventually returned while I was eating a plate of unsatisfying hospital food. She gave me a warm smile and took a seat in the chair beside me.
"Hello, my name is Dr. Schroeder. My staff and I have been watching over you these past few days."
She took a glance at her clipboard.
"It looks like you took quite a nasty fall. You were found by two hikers, lying in the snow at the bottom of a slope. They thought you were dead until you grabbed one of them by the arm and threatened to kill them. You must have been, delirious. But they did the right thing and called the authorities. Since you were in the mountains, you had to take a ride in the chopper. You were found so close to the border that you ended up here in Deutschland. Let me be the first to welcome you to Germany. I must say, it is truly a miracle that you did not succumb to hypothermia. When you came in, we thought for sure that you would not make it."
Her words trailed off. I didn't care about the meaningless details. I was alive. I had won. I survived an entire legion of undead Nazis, and I had fucking won. Dr. Schroeder suddenly reached into her lab coat and produced a small metal object, which she held up for me to see.
"We found this in your jacket pocket. Did you find this when you were on the mountain?"
I nodded. Dr. Schroeder sighed with a look of regret on her face.
"This relic brings back many memories that our country wishes to forget, however."
She looked down at the object with a frown before placing it on my bed tray.
It does make for quite the souvenir.
She got up and walked towards the doorway, but stopped and looked at me once more before exiting the room.
I'm glad you made it out of there. 5 years ago, my twin sister disappeared in those mountains. Her name was Elizabeth. She was never found.
Dr. Schroeder gave me an awkward smile before closing the door. Her footsteps faded down the hall. I turned my attention to the rusted iron cross that sat before me. A smile spread across my face as I picked it up, caressing the tiny swastika etched upon its surface. I closed my hand around it tightly and watched with my glowing eyes as black fluid trickled out from between my fingers. From outside the hospital window, somewhere far off in the distance, I heard a familiar symphony over the howling of the wind.